Welcome. Settle into wherever you're resting now. Let the weight of the day begin to leave you, not all at once, but slowly, the way light leaves the sky at dusk, one layer at a time. Breathe in, and as you breathe out, allow your shoulders to drop a little lower than they were. You do not need to hold anything up tonight. The story will carry you. There is a planet you will never visit. It no longer exists. By the time the light from its destruction reaches us, and it does reach us travelling at the speed of the universe's most patient messenger, there is nothing left to mourn, only the afterglow of something that once was magnificent. That is where this story begins. Not with a hero, not with a power or a symbol or a cape. It begins with a cradle, and a father who understood something terrible, and a mother who chose hope over grief in the longest possible final moment. Krypton was not merely a planet. It was a civilization so advanced that its scientists had mapped the interior geology of stars. Its architecture grew from crystalline materials that did not exist on any other world. Its people had evolved past the need for the kind of effort that humans call struggle, or so they believed. They had solved disease, extended life, built thinking machines, and catalogued the movement of galaxies. And in that solving, in that cataloguing, they had also stopped listening to the one thing that cannot be modelled or predicted, the quiet, persistent warning underneath the world. Jor-El heard it. He was not the only one who suspected the truth, but he was the one who refused to stop suspecting it even when the evidence became inconvenient, even when the Science Council looked at his models and chose to interpret their uncertainty as error rather than alarm. The planet's core was destabilizing. Not metaphorically, not eventually, imminently. The geological chains that held Krypton together at its centre were unravelling in slow cascades that would, within a calculable window, become impossible to reverse. Jor-El brought these findings before the Council. He brought them carefully with the full weight of his reputation and his methodology, and the Council thanked him for his concern and declined to act. There is something worth sitting with here. The particular human experience of knowing something true that the people around you refuse to accept. You may have felt it yourself in smaller ways. The knowledge that a relationship was ending before anyone said so, the awareness that a plan would fail before it began, the quiet certainty about something that others dismissed as anxiety. Jor-El felt this on a civilizational scale. He knew his world was dying, and he could not make anyone believe him in time. That is not a superhero origin story, that is a grief story. It begins in grief. What he could do, the only thing he could do, was build a rocket small enough for one passenger. Not a fleet, not an ark, a single vessel, barely large enough to hold an infant and the knowledge of everything he wanted to pass on. He and his wife Lara argued over this, as people argue over the unbearable when they are trying not to collapse under it. They could not both fit. They would not sacrifice their child to the planet's failure to listen. And so they chose the thing that parents in crisis have chosen across every culture and every century. They chose to send their child towards safety, even when safety meant distance, even when distance meant goodbye. The star they aimed for was yellow. That matters more than it might seem, and we will return to it. But the first thing to understand is simply this. Kal-El was not launched toward Earth because Earth was special. He was launched toward Earth because Earth was reachable, because its sun was the right kind of warmth, and because Jor-El's calculations suggested it could sustain Kryptonian biology. The choice of destination was not destiny. It was physics. What happened after was something else entirely. The rocket cleared Krypton's atmosphere moments before the planet died. Let that land fully. Moments, not hours, not days. Moments. The civilization that had solved almost everything, that had mapped the interior of stars, that had outlasted the natural lifespan of a dozen species on a dozen worlds. Gone. The crystal towers, the recorded history, the Science Council, the arguments, the streets, the language, the memory of every person who had ever laughed or loved or doubted on that world, all of it compressed into nothing in the span of time it takes to draw a breath. Jor-El and Lara were there, They did not look away. The rocket travelled for years. Inside it, a child who would not remember any of this would never have access to the specific grief of knowing what he had lost before he could understand loss. Slept in the quiet dark between stars. This is the origin of something that everyone who hears it tends to oversimplify. They remember the powers. They remember the symbol. They do not often sit with the strangeness of what it means to be the last of something, to carry a civilization in your cells without having any memory of its streets. He landed in Kansas. A farmer and his wife found him. They were not soldiers, not scientists, not chosen by any authority. They were people who knew how to tend things that needed tending, people whose whole life had been built around the patience of seasons and the knowledge that growth takes the time it takes and cannot be rushed. Jonathan and Martha Kent named him Clark. They raised him as their own. They gave him the only thing Jor-El could not put in the rocket, a childhood. And in doing so, they shaped the single most consequential choice in the history of the Earth, though no one, including them, understood it that way at the time, because the powers came slowly, not all at once the way a switch is flipped. They arrived the way a voice drops during adolescence, unpredictably in increments, sometimes at the worst possible moment. Strength first, probably. The awareness that something in his grip was different, that the world around him was fragile in a way he had to keep remembering. Then speed, which would have felt like stillness to him, everything else simply becoming slower while he remained constant. Then the senses, which may have been the hardest, because there is no way to prepare a child for the moment the world becomes too loud and too close all at once. Jonathan Kent understood something that very few people in this story get credit for understanding. He knew that the question of what Clark was could wait. The question of who Clark was could not. So he taught him to grow things. He taught him the particular quiet of early mornings before the rest of the world was awake. He taught him that strength without gentleness is just damage waiting to happen. Martha taught him to listen, to look at people rather than past them, to find the specific gravity of the ordinary. Between the two of them, without any school for this, without any precedent, they built a human being out of someone who was not technically human. That is the miracle at the centre of this story, not the powers. The miracle is that it worked. The miracle is that a child from a dead civilization, raised by two people in the middle of an American farm in the middle of the 20th century, grew up to believe, genuinely without irony, without the armour of cynicism, that people were worth protecting. That is not the default position of someone with unlimited power. It is not the position you would predict if you were modelling the psychology from first principles. It is the specific outcome of two specific people making thousands of specific choices over the course of a specific childhood. It is very nearly impossible, and it happened. By the time Clark Kent arrived in Metropolis as an adult, the powers were fully present and fully understood. By him, if not yet by the world. He could see through walls. He could hear conversations happening on the other side of a city. He could move faster than any technology humanity had built could track. He could withstand temperatures that would vaporize steel. He could lift things that should not be liftable, and had no word for the upper limit of what those things might be, because he had not yet found one. He was, in the most literal sense possible, without peer on this planet. And he chose to become a journalist. He chose to spend his days sitting at a desk, typing, drinking bad coffee, being occasionally condescended to by editors, taking the bus. He chose Clark Kent, the glasses, the mild manner, the deliberate diminishment of himself into someone who would not alarm anyone. This was not weakness, and it was not cowardice. This was a choice made by someone who had thought carefully about power, and had concluded that the most dangerous thing he could do was let it be visible all the time. He did not want the world organised around his existence. He wanted to live inside it. The farm had a particular quality at certain hours that Clark never stopped returning to in memory, even decades later, and many miles above the surface that held it. It was the quality of early morning before the animals had fully announced the day, a blue-grey stillness that belonged to no particular season, that arrived the same way in January as in June, in which the world seemed to be holding its breath before committing to whatever it was about to become. He would stand in the yard in those hours before anyone else was awake, and he would listen. Not to anything in particular, to everything, which is a different kind of listening entirely. Jonathan's hands were calloused in the specific way of someone who worked with them daily, and had done so for decades without complaint or ceremony. Clark noticed this with the visual acuity he was still learning to calibrate, the way the light caught the texture of them, the map of small scars that documented years of encounters with fences and tools, and the various sharp edges that farm work presents without warning. He understood, watching those hands, something important about what strength meant when it was not supernatural. It meant showing up, repeatedly, for the ordinary demands of the world you had chosen to inhabit. Jonathan never talked about this. He demonstrated it. The rocket sat in the barn for years. Jonathan had covered it carefully with canvas and had told Clark about it on his 13th birthday, sitting in the barn with the afternoon light coming through the slats in long golden bars and the smell of hay and machinery surrounding them both. The conversation that followed was the most important conversation of Clark's life, and Jonathan knew it, and Clark did not yet fully know it, but would understand, looking back, that his father had prepared for it with the same thoroughness he brought to every other task that mattered. He had thought carefully about what to say and what to leave unsaid. He had decided to leave very little unsaid. Martha kept a journal. Clark did not know this for many years, and when he finally understood it, found the shelf of notebooks in the back of the closet she had mentioned once and never mentioned again. He sat with one of them for a long time before he opened it. What he found inside was not the extraordinary story of raising an alien child. It was the ordinary story of raising a child, written with the particular attention of someone who understood that ordinary things are only ordinary from the outside, that from the inside every moment of a child's development is extraordinary to someone who loves the child. She had written about his first words and his first attempt at walking, and the first time he had laughed at something, and the first time he had cried. She had written about the fear and the love in proportions that shifted over the years, as the fear became more manageable and the love became more complex. Rest here for a moment. Let the breath move in and out at its own pace. You have travelled a long distance already, from a dying planet to a Kansas field to the middle of a city. The story is just beginning, but the foundation is already remarkable. A civilization ended. A child survived. Two ordinary people made something extraordinary, not through power, but through patience and love, and the daily work of paying attention. And now that child is a man walking through a world that does not yet know what it contains. Let your breath settle a little deeper now. If your eyes are still open, let them close. The room around you can stay as it is. The sounds, the temperature, whatever is present. None of it needs to change. What changes is simply where your attention goes. Let it go inward, into the space where stories live when they are allowed to slow down. The world did not know what it was dealing with. That is the starting point for everything that follows. When Superman appeared publicly for the first time, the timing varies depending on which telling you trust, but the effect was consistent. The initial response was not celebration. It was confusion, then fear dressed as skepticism, then a kind of breathless, half-reluctant awe. Humans are not naturally equipped to process someone who can do what he can do. The categories do not exist. The closest reference are mythological, and mythology is comfortable precisely because it is safely in the past. He was not in the past. He was here, visible, catching falling aircraft and redirecting floodwaters and stepping between armed people and the people they intended to harm. The government wanted to know who he was and what he wanted. The military wanted to know his vulnerabilities and his loyalties. The press wanted to know his name. The public wanted to know if he was safe, which is a very different question from whether he was good, and the difference matters enormously. Clark Kent, sitting at his desk at the Daily Planet, understood all of this with a clarity that his colleagues could not have guessed at. He had spent his entire life studying the distance between what people fear and what they actually face. He had grown up being the unknown quantity, the thing that could not be categorized, the boy who had to learn to calibrate every handshake so that it did not become a crushing. He knew, better than anyone, what it felt like to be in the same room as something that could level the room without raising its voice. He knew because he was that thing. He had been learning to live with it since childhood. The deliberate construction of Superman as a public presence, as distinct from Clark Kent as a private one, was one of the most sophisticated acts of social engineering in human history, and it was performed entirely by one person, alone, without a committee or a strategy session, or a branding consultant. He understood instinctively that people needed something they could relate the power to, not explain. Relating and explaining are different. They needed a symbol that told them which side the power was on, the cape, the symbol on the chest, the specific posture of standing in a way that was open rather than closed, non-threatening despite being terrifying. These were not costume choices, they were a language. He was saying, with his body, at all times, I see you. I am not here to frighten you. The power is pointed outward, not inward. You are what it protects, not what it threatens. He said this continuously, in every public appearance, in every interaction with authorities, in his willingness to be questioned and studied and doubted. He submitted to all of it, not because he had to, and this is the crucial thing, but because he understood that the submission itself was the message. The most dangerous being on earth was asking for permission. What that act communicated was something that no amount of strength could otherwise convey. Think about what genuine restraint costs. Not the restraint of someone who does not have the power to do otherwise. That is simply limitation, and it teaches nothing. The restraint of someone who could end an argument instantly, could reshape a situation by will alone, who could move faster than the consequences of any choice could catch up to him, and who chooses not to. Who slows down deliberately, who stays inside the frame of negotiation and law and the messy human machinery of consent. That is a different kind of strength entirely. It does not get celebrated often enough because it is invisible. The thing that didn't happen leaves no evidence. Batman understood this, and it troubled him. That is worth noting carefully, because Bruce Wayne's understanding of Superman was never simple, and the complications in it tell us something important about what Superman actually is. Batman had built his entire existence on the premise that preparation and intelligence and the right technology could address any threat. He had contingency plans for contingency plans. He had a file on every member of the Justice League, not because he distrusted them exactly, but because trust without verification is not a strategy, it is a hope, and he did not allow himself to operate on hope alone. When he built a contingency plan for Superman, he was not betraying a friend. He was doing exactly what his psychology required him to do. He was taking the possibility of catastrophe seriously. And the catastrophe he was planning for was not Superman choosing evil. It was Superman losing the ability to choose at all, the erosion of will, the compromise of mind, the moment when the most powerful being on the planet was no longer navigating by the values that had always kept the power directed correctly. The danger was not malevolence. The danger was accident. The danger was what happens when the architecture of restraint fails. Kryptonite was the clearest expression of this fear, but also the most misunderstood. People remember it as a weakness, a vulnerability, the one thing that can bring Superman down. But that framing gets something fundamentally wrong. Kryptonite is not a flaw in Superman. Kryptonite is a consequence of what he is, a being energized by a yellow sun, whose cells are in a constant state of solar absorption, whose biology is running on a different operating system than every other organism on this planet. When he encounters the radiation of his own destroyed world, the signal conflicts. The systems that make him extraordinary are also the systems that Kryptonite disrupts. You cannot separate the power from the vulnerability. They are the same thing. This is the first of several ways in which Superman is a more philosophically complex figure than his reputation suggests. He is often discussed as though he is simply a power fantasy, the answer to the question of what it would feel like to be invincible. But invincibility is not what he is. He is someone who runs at extraordinary power and extraordinary cost simultaneously, someone whose very nature contains its own limitation, someone who cannot go home because home no longer exists. The fantasy is more complicated than it looks. Most genuine things are. His relationship with Lois Lane complicated things further in the way that all genuine relationships complicate everything they touch. Lois was the most relentless investigative journalist of her generation, a woman who had built her career on the principle that the story was worth the risk, and that the risk was worth taking. She was not intimidated by authority, any kind of authority, including the kind that could bench press a battleship. She saw past the symbol to the person behind it with an accuracy that should have been impossible, given the lengths he went to keep those two things separate. What she saw first was the story. What she stayed for was the man. And what the man could offer her was something he could not fully offer anyone else. The truth of what he was, held in the presence of someone who would not flinch from it. He had spent so much of his life calibrating, diminishing, measuring every interaction against what could go wrong if he was not careful. With Lois, eventually he could stop measuring. That kind of rest is not nothing. For someone who carries what he carries, it may be the most necessary thing in the world. The city of Metropolis shaped him too, in ways that are easy to overlook. Cities are argument machines. They put incompatible things next to each other and demand that everyone find a way to coexist, or at least to function alongside the coexistence. Metropolis was brighter than Gotham, more vertical, more optimistic in its architectural ambition. It reached upward rather than inward, and Superman, arriving in this city, found that its energy matched something in his own disposition. This instinct toward the light, toward the forward motion, toward the belief that the next moment could be better than the last if someone was willing to do the work of making it so. He was not naive. The word naive misses something essential about him. Naivety is the position of someone who has not yet encountered sufficient evidence of the world's difficulty. Clark Kent had encountered more than sufficient evidence. He had grown up knowing that one wrong moment could end someone. He had chosen optimism not in the absence of that knowledge, but because of it. Because he understood that the alternative, the giving up, the retreat into cynicism, was a form of surrender that he could not justify when he was capable of what he was capable of. The hope was not innocent. It was earned. It was maintained against gravity, the way all genuine hope is. The Daily Planet was a particular kind of institution, the kind that had developed, over its long history, a culture with enough internal coherence to function as a world in itself, with its own hierarchies and rituals and standards of conduct and shared references that made it legible to its members in a way that required years of membership to fully access. Perry White ran it with the combination of absolute editorial conviction and deeply personal investment in the people who worked there that made him one of the most effective editors in the history of the profession. He shouted a great deal. He was also, underneath the shouting, someone who understood that the best journalism required the kind of psychological safety that his shouting superficially seemed to preclude, and who had developed a way of providing that safety that was invisible to anyone who had not been paying close attention for long enough. The press credential was a kind of armour that Clark had come to appreciate for reasons that had nothing to do with professional access. It gave him a reason to be in places without a reason, a socially legible explanation for presence that asked no further questions. He had spent much of his adult life navigating the problem of being somewhere without a story for why he was there, the problem that every double identity creates, which is the problem of accounting for the gaps between what you say you were doing and where you actually were. The press credential closed some of those gaps. It was not a perfect solution, but it was a remarkably useful one. Lois noticed things. This is something that her colleagues acknowledged without always understanding the full implication of it. She noticed the specific tells of sources who were shading the truth, the micro changes in respiratory rate and postural alignment that most people processed subconsciously, and she processed consciously, having trained herself to pay attention to them the way a musician trains to hear things an untrained ear passes over. She noticed the way certain officials became suddenly cautious in specific conversations, which told her where the important things were being concealed. She noticed Clark Kent's hands in a way that she never directly addressed, but that shaped her understanding of him in ways she would not fully articulate for years. The relationship between Superman and the Metropolis Police Department was a masterwork of ongoing institutional negotiation that had taken years to reach its current equilibrium. The department's initial response to his presence had been predictably territorial. This was their city. These were their crimes. The intervention of an outside party, however capable, created jurisdictional and procedural complications that the existing legal framework was entirely unequipped to address. He had approached these complications with a patience that the police commissioner, decades later, would describe as the most impressive display of institutional diplomacy he had ever encountered. Superman had never demanded authority. He had simply made himself useful, consistently and without ego, in ways that the department could not replicate, while actively avoiding the situations where his presence would have undermined the department's own competence. You can let your breathing slow a little more now. The story is settling around you. We have established the architecture, the discipline and the deliberateness, the way power was shaped by choice into something that resembled trustworthiness, the relationships and the city and the daily work of being what he was without letting it overwhelm what he had chosen to be. In the segments ahead, the architecture will be tested. For now, simply rest in the understanding of how carefully it was built. Breathe in slowly and out. Let the muscles around your eyes soften. There is nothing to track right now, nothing to follow or manage. The story moves at the pace of breath tonight. Let it come to you rather than reaching for it. Yellow sunlight is the engine of everything. This is the fact that the symbol and cape version of the story tends to gloss over, but it is the most important biological reality in understanding what Superman is, and, more importantly, what he becomes when the conditions change. Under Earth's yellow sun, his cells are in a state of continuous energization that has no equivalent in human physiology. Every moment he spends in sunlight is a moment in which his body is storing capacity for strength, for speed, for the particular cellular density that makes him resistant to damage, for the sensory range that extends his perception far beyond what any instrument could replicate. This is not magic. It is not metaphor. It is a specific interaction between his Kryptonian biology and the radiation spectrum of a G-type main sequence star. Krypton orbited a red sun, older, cooler, emitting a different quality of light that his cells were calibrated to process at baseline levels. Under Krypton's sun, he would have been a normal person. Exceptional by Kryptonian standards, perhaps. Jor-El's sun, scientifically gifted, raised with care, but not extraordinary in the sense that the word applies on Earth. Not invulnerable, not fast beyond the limits of the body, not capable of flight. The red sun would have given him a life. The yellow sun gave him something else entirely. The implications of this are more strange and more vertiginous than they first appear. His power is not intrinsic to him in the way that a human's intelligence is intrinsic, or a human's personality. It is granted to him by a star that has no knowledge of him and no intention toward him. He did not earn it. He did not train for it. He did not choose it. He arrived in the right place, at the right time, with the right biology, and the sun did the rest. This is worth sitting with, because it is the source of both his greatest capability and his most persistent philosophical discomfort. He knows that he did not deserve this. He knows that deserving had nothing to do with it. And he has spent his entire adult life trying to figure out what the correct response to unearned power actually is. The answer he arrived at, and it is the right answer, though not the only possible one, is service. Not submission, not self-erasure, but the deliberate redirection of what he has been given toward the people who need it. He chose to understand the power as a loan, not a possession. Something held in trust rather than owned. This framing has practical consequences. It means he's always asking whether he's using it well, always measuring the gap between what he could do and what he should do, always aware that the gap is real and significant and not something that can be collapsed through good intentions alone. There are versions of him, in the deepest and most difficult corners of the story, where that gap collapses in the wrong direction, where should gives way to could, where the restraint architecture comes apart under sufficient pressure. Those versions are not cautionary tales about evil. They are cautionary tales about grief, about exhaustion, about what happens when someone who has been holding the weight of the world for long enough simply cannot hold it anymore. We will come to those versions. They are part of the complete picture, but they cannot be understood without first understanding the baseline, the genuine, sustained, costly commitment to service that defines the version we know best. His body, under full solar charge, is a remarkable object. The term invulnerable is technically imprecise. There are things that affect him, things that can slow him, exhaust him, even harm him under the right conditions. But in practical terms, the experience of attempting to damage him is the experience of attempting to damage something that has already absorbed more energy than the attack contains. A bullet strikes him, and the bullet fails. An explosion engulfs him, and the shockwave carries him a short distance, and the heat dissipates against his skin without consequence. Fire does not concern him. Pressure does not concern him. Falling does not concern him, because falling implies the relevance of the ground, and the ground is simply one of many possible landing places. He can hear a heartbeat at 100 meters. He can hear two heartbeats and distinguish between them, can tell from the rhythm and the pace whether the owner is calm or frightened or running. He can hear a conversation on the other side of a city if he listens for it, can filter thousands of simultaneous sound sources to isolate the one that matters. The cry, the alarm, the specific frequency of distress that cuts through everything else. This hearing is not always comfortable. The world is very loud when you cannot choose not to hear it. Learning to live with the constant input of a city's worth of sound is a discipline that took him years, and some days it still costs more than he shows. His vision extends in directions that have no names in human sensory vocabulary. He sees wavelengths that no human eye reaches, can look through walls with a perceptual mode that is not quite sight in any ordinary sense, more like a sustained awareness of what occupies space behind an opaque surface. He can look at a person and see the machinery underneath, the bones, the moving tissues, the electrical signals that carry thought from one cluster of neurons to another. He has chosen deliberately never to use this ability on people without their knowledge or consent. This is another invisible piece of the restraint architecture. Another thing that cost him something to decide and cost him something every time he maintains the decision. Flight is the one that seems most like fantasy, but it is actually the most grounded in the logic of what he is. His cells, fully energized, generate a bioelectric field that interacts with the Earth's gravitational and electromagnetic environment, in a way that allows him to move through air as though it were water, resisting it, pushing against it, treating it as a medium rather than an emptiness. He does not fall upward. He moves, deliberately in 3 dimensions, responding to intention with a directness that no aircraft can replicate, because no aircraft is also a thinking being with opinions about its destination. He can cross continents in minutes. He can reach the upper atmosphere where the air thins to almost nothing, and the curve of the Earth is visible against the dark of space. He has gone further. He has gone to space. Space does not kill him. That last fact deserves particular attention. He can survive in the vacuum of space. He can survive on the surface of the moon. He can travel, under sufficient solar charge, far enough from Earth's atmosphere to be, in every practical sense, somewhere else in the solar system. The range of this capability has not been fully tested, partly because testing it would require him to leave Earth unprotected for the duration, and that is a cost he has consistently declined to pay. But the capability exists. He is not, in the most foundational sense, limited to this planet. He is here because he chooses to be here. Every day he spends on Earth is a chosen day. There is something worth pausing on in that. You may have felt at certain moments in your own life the particular weight of being somewhere by choice rather than necessity, of understanding that you could leave and choosing to stay. That choice is not free. It costs something every time it is made. It requires that you continue to believe the staying is worth it, that the place and the people are worth the limitation, that the roots you have put down here are real enough to hold you. For him, the choice to remain on Earth is made against a backdrop of almost unlimited mobility. He could go anywhere. He stays here. He stays because of the Kents, because of Lois, because of the specific faces of the people he has caught as they fell. He stays because leaving would mean something he cannot accept. Under a red sun, all of this goes away. This is one of the most disorienting facts about him, and one he has had to sit with in some of the story's hardest moments. Strip away the yellow sun's radiation, replace it with the older, cooler light of a red dwarf, and the cells that have been running at extraordinary capacity simply stop. Not immediately, but steadily, like a machine winding down when the power source is removed. He becomes progressively more ordinary. The strength fades, the speed fades, the invulnerability fades. What remains is a man, a fit, intelligent, determined man, but a man in the way that all men are men, finite, frangible, very much aware of the ground. He has found himself in that position. He has been depowered, temporarily, by various means across the long history of his story. And what those moments reveal, consistently, is that the person the powers were given to was always worthy of them. Not because he is specially heroic without them, he is, but that is not the point, but because his response to losing them is never relief and never resentment. It is simply an adjustment. He does what he can with what he has, in the way that someone who genuinely serves does not stop serving when the conditions become difficult. The sun will rise again. It always does. And when it does, the cells begin to absorb once more, and the capacity returns, and the man who was briefly as vulnerable as anyone gradually becomes again what the yellow star makes him. There is something almost seasonal about this rhythm, something that rhymes with the way all of us move through periods of depletion and recovery, through the times when what we have to give runs low, and the times when it returns. His version is more literal, but the shape of it is recognizable. The moment of first flight, the moment when he understood fully what his body could do in relation to gravity, is described differently in different versions of the story, which suggests that the event was experienced in a way that resists single definitive narration. What the versions share is the quality of revelation. Not surprise exactly, because some part of him had always known the body was capable of more than it was expressing, but confirmation. The sky received him. The atmosphere, which humans experience as an invisible medium of breath and weather, revealed itself as a navigable space with its own textures and currents and altitudes that each offered different information about the world below. He went higher than he meant to the first time. The view from above the cloud layer, looking down at the continent arranged below him, in the specific configuration of something seen for the first time from the correct angle, was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. His relationship to food is one of the quieter peculiarities of his existence that the story only occasionally addresses directly. He can eat. He does eat because the social function of shared meals is important to him, and because the experience of taste is not absent from his biology, merely less essential than it is for beings who require caloric input to function. The yellow sun does the metabolic work that food does for humans. He eats for pleasure, for company, for the texture of participation in the ordinary human activity of nourishment. He has preferences, things that Martha made that he has never stopped seeking approximations of. The specific combination of ingredients that activates a memory of sitting at a kitchen table in Kansas with the morning outside the window. Sleep is optional for him in a technical sense and present in his life in a practical one. His body does not require the unconscious recovery period that human biology demands. The cellular repair, the memory consolidation, the hormonal reset that happens during sleep and without which human cognitive function degrades rapidly. He can remain fully awake and fully functional for periods that would be catastrophic for any human. He nevertheless sleeps, most nights, for reasons that are psychological rather than physiological. The transition from wakefulness to sleep is one of the few moments in his experience when the sensory input reduces to something manageable, when the hearing that extends across a city finally quiets, when the visual processing that never entirely stops finally eases, when the body that is always ready closes down to something approaching rest. The Fortress of Solitude was built from Kryptonian crystal technology that he carried in the rocket, one of the few non-biological items that Jor-El had included in the vessel, alongside the artificial intelligence that carried his consciousness and the genetic archive of Kryptonian life. The crystal, activated in the Arctic, grew into something that was partly architecture and partly memory palace, a space that functioned simultaneously as a laboratory, a repository of Kryptonian culture and history, and the one place on Earth where he could be fully himself without the translation layer that human social interaction always required. He went there when he needed to think without the weight of the world pressing against every thought. He went there when the loneliness of being the last of something became loud enough that it needed a space to exist in without commentary. Let that recognition settle quietly now. The sun that made him extraordinary also made him dependent on something outside himself, something vast and indifferent and beyond his control. In that dependency there is a strange kind of kinship with every other living thing on this planet. We're all running on borrowed light. His lone is just more dramatic than most. Let the breath deepen again. There is no urgency here. The night is long, and the story has room for everything. Let yourself sink a little further into wherever you're resting, and let the words come to you like water finding its level, slowly, completely, without effort. The House of El had a crest. On Krypton, family sigils were not decorative in the way that human heraldry tends toward decoration. They were architectural, embedded in the structures that families built, in the documents they produced, in the ceremonial garments worn at events that mark the passages of a life. The House of El was one of the most distinguished scientific families in Kryptonian history, and its sigil was a stylized character from the Kryptonian writing system that, in its angular elegance, communicated something about precision and aspiration, about the reaching of mind toward things not yet understood. Jor-El wore it, Lara knew its weight, and Kal-El, launched into the dark between stars, wore it on his chest in the blanket they wrapped him in, the last material gesture of parents who would not survive to see him grow. That symbol arrived on Earth as a Kryptonian family crest, and became something that has no equivalent in the history of any culture on this planet. It became a symbol not of a family, or a nation, or a religion, or a political movement. the categories that human symbols tend to organize around. It became a symbol of an idea, the idea that power and goodness are not mutually exclusive, the idea that the strongest thing in the room can also be the safest thing in the room, the idea that someone capable of ending everything might choose, instead, to protect everything. This idea is not self-evident. It is not the way power usually behaves. The symbol insists on it anyway. Clark chose to display it, to centre it, to make it the most visible part of himself when he was operating as Superman. This was not vanity. It was communication of the most efficient kind. In a world where he needed to establish in the first second of an encounter that he was not a threat, the symbol did the work that no number of words could do. People who had never met him and would never meet him had already formed a relationship with what the symbol meant. When they saw it, their nervous systems, conditioned by the stories, the rescues, the visible record of every choice he had made, released rather than tensed. That release was the goal. The symbol was a calibration tool for the collective fear response of an entire civilization. He was aware of the responsibility this created. You cannot claim a symbol and then behave contrary to it without consequence. Not for you personally, but for the thing the symbol stands for. If Superman ever acted in a way that was destructive, arbitrary, self-serving, or cruel, the symbol would absorb that act. Every person who had looked at it and felt safe would have that safety retroactively revised. The meaning would change, and the meaning, once changed in that direction, is extraordinarily difficult to retrieve. He carried this awareness with him continuously. It shaped every decision, every interaction, every moment when the easier path and the right path diverged. Lex Luthor understood the symbol better than almost anyone, and he despised it on exactly those grounds. Luthor was, in many respects, the most intelligent human being alive, a mind of extraordinary range and discipline, a person who had constructed himself from difficult origins into a position of such power and influence that most human institutions bent toward him rather than the reverse. He had done this through will, through intelligence, through the willingness to see the world as it was rather than as people wished it to be. He had no patience for sentiment. He had even less patience for the idea that virtue could be genuine rather than performed. When he looked at Superman, he did not see a hero. He saw a symbol that was working, a symbol that was shaping public consciousness in a direction he found deeply objectionable. What objected him was not the power itself. Luthor had always respected power. What objected him was the dependence the symbol created. A world that looked to Superman for safety was a world that had outsourced its own capacity for self-reliance. A world that trusted the symbol was a world that had chosen a single point of failure for its entire security architecture. And beyond the strategic objection, below it, underneath it, running deeper than Luthor would ever acknowledge, was the simpler and more honest thing. The symbol made him feel insufficient. And insufficiency was the one feeling Lex Luthor had organized his entire life to never experience again. Their conflict is one of the great ongoing arguments of the story, not between good and evil in any simple sense, but between two different theories of what humanity is and what it needs. Superman's theory: people are capable of extraordinary things when they are protected enough to be brave, when the space exists in which the better possibilities can develop. Luthor's theory: people are capable of extraordinary things when they are forced to rely on themselves, when the safety net is removed, when the easy option, the alien who will come and fix it, is not available. Both theories contain real observations about human nature. Neither is entirely wrong. The argument between them is genuinely unresolved, which is part of what makes it enduring. The Amazons understood the symbol differently, not with Luthor's antagonism, but with the particular clear-eyed assessment of people who had been thinking about power and its uses for millennia. Diana of Themyscira, when she first encountered Superman, brought to that encounter the full weight of a warrior tradition that predated every human civilization currently operating on the surface of the earth. She had seen power used well and used badly across spans of time that put his brief history in humbling perspective. Her assessment of him was not awed. It was careful, measured, and ultimately respectful. The respect that one combatant offers another who has demonstrated genuine capability paired with genuine discipline. What Diana recognised, and what her recognition meant for the symbol, was that it translated across the boundary of culture and mythology. The idea it represented was not specifically American, not specifically 20th century, not limited to the context in which it had developed. The idea that the strongest can also be the most protective. She had a name for that in Themysciran tradition. She had stories about it that stretched back to the wars of gods. She had trained for it, had dedicated her existence to embodying it. Seeing it in him, she was not discovering something new. She was recognizing something ancient in a new form. The symbol's most severe test came in the moments when it was used against him, when enemies understood that the symbol was load-bearing, that people's trust in it was structural, that if you could damage the symbol, you could damage something more valuable than any physical target. They aimed there. Manufactured scenarios designed to make him appear dangerous, unreliable, or hypocritical. Situations engineered so that any choice he made could be framed as a violation of what he stood for. These attacks were more sophisticated than physical ones, and considerably harder to defend against, because his strength offered no protection from them. He handled them imperfectly. This is important to acknowledge. There were moments when the pressure of the symbol's expectations produced responses in him that were smaller than the expectations deserved. Moments of frustration, moments of withdrawal, moments where the impossibility of being everything the symbol had come to mean made him less rather than more. He is not a perfect being. The Kents raised him with values, not with invincibility of character. He made mistakes. He misjudged. He occasionally chose the wrong thing, or the right thing too late, or the right thing in the wrong way. And then he did something that separates him from both the mythological figures he resembles and the political leaders he is sometimes compared to. He acknowledged it. He corrected course. He did not protect his own narrative at the expense of the truth. That willingness to correct, to say, in effect, the symbol does not excuse me from accountability, it makes accountability more important, is perhaps the most underrated aspect of what he is. Anyone can build a symbol, sustaining it honestly over years, under conditions that continuously generate reasons to prioritize the symbol over the truth, is a different kind of work. It is the work of someone who genuinely believes in the thing rather than merely in their association with it. The symbol spread in ways he did not plan and could not entirely control. Other people adopted it, put it on themselves, carried it into situations where it conferred their work with a legitimacy it may or may not have deserved. He watched this with a complicated feeling that he rarely discussed. The awareness that something he had not owned but had been trusted with was now moving through the world under its own momentum, meaning different things to different people, sometimes being used in ways that would have troubled him if he had been consulted. The symbol had become larger than him. In some respects, this was exactly what it was supposed to do. In others, it was a reminder that nothing you put into the world stays entirely yours. Rest in that for a moment. There is something recognizable in it, the experience of having contributed something to the world, and then watching it take on a life that was not entirely what you intended. Ideas do this. Traditions do this. The things we teach other people, and the ways we model possibility for the people watching us. They go on after our involvement with them ends, continuing in directions we cannot predict. His version of this was simply more visible and more consequential than most. The symbol of the House of El, wrapped around an infant in a dying world's last gesture of hope, became something that shaped the moral imagination of an entire planet. No one designed that. It grew. The House of L's history on Krypton extended back through generations that predated the Scientific Council's dominance of Kryptonian governance. The early L's had been explorers, in the geological and astronomical sense, people who had devoted their lives to the mapping of what existed beyond the immediate and the known. There was a tradition within the family, documented in the archives that he eventually accessed through the fortress, of arriving at conclusions that the contemporary consensus found unsettling and pursuing those conclusions anyway. Jor-El was not an aberration in this respect. He was the most consequential expression of a recurring pattern, the family's long-running disagreement with the idea that established understanding sets the limit of what can be known. The number of times the symbol has been replicated, reproduced, adapted, and carried by people who had no connection to him and no authorization from him is beyond counting. It appears on the sides of buildings in cities he has never visited. It is tattooed on the skin of people who have experienced crises from which they felt they were rescued, not by him specifically, but by someone or something that the symbol had come to represent. It appears in the artwork of cultures that have developed their own readings of what the symbol means, readings that often diverge significantly from the origin story, but that illuminate something real about what the symbol has come to contain. He does not police this. The symbol was never his to police. It belongs to the people who have found meaning in it. Lex Luthor's intelligence operated in a specific register that was different from his own, in ways that were instructive about the nature of exceptional minds. Luthor's intelligence was fundamentally acquisitive, oriented toward the accumulation of understanding as a form of power, toward the conversion of knowledge into leverage, toward the identification of patterns that others had missed and the exploitation of those patterns before the others caught up. It was extraordinarily effective intelligence. It had built Luthor a position of influence that no ordinary human could have built in a single lifetime. It was also, at its foundation, organized around scarcity, around the assumption that understanding and capability were finite resources whose possession by one person reduced their availability to others. The memorial in Centennial Park, the one erected after Doomsday and maintained through all the subsequent complicated history, shows him not in the posture of action, but in the posture of stillness, standing, looking outward, hands at his sides rather than raised or clenched. The sculptor, when asked about the choice, said that every other representation of him she had studied showed him in motion, flying, catching, intervening. She had wanted to capture the thing that the motion obscured, the steadiness underneath it, the quality of someone who had thought carefully about what they were about to do and was in the moment before doing it, fully present, fully committed, carrying the weight of the choice without being crushed by it. The breath moves through you now without effort. Let the symbol rest in your mind, not as an image, but as a feeling. The feeling of being held in safety by something that has chosen to be gentle. That is what the crest was always trying to say. That is what it still says, in every version of this story, across every telling. The most powerful thing in the room has decided to protect you. Rest now in that decision. Breathe out slowly. Let the exhale be longer than the inhale, not forced, just allowed. The longer exhale is the body's way of moving toward rest, a signal the nervous system knows without being taught. Let the story find you wherever you are in that movement toward quiet. The question that follows him through every telling of this story, the question that Luthor asks loudest, but that every serious observer eventually asks, is this: why doesn't he just run it? The planet, the systems, the governments and economies and military architectures that humans have built to manage their collective existence. He could. There is no serious argument against the technical feasibility. He is faster than any response system humanity has built. He is more durable than any weapon currently aimed at any target on Earth. He has the cognitive processing to model complex systems, the physical capability to enforce any outcome he decided on, and the moral framework, by his own account, to make better decisions than the ones currently being made. The case for his rule, made coldly, is not ridiculous. He has heard the case made, not always coldly, sometimes with grief, by people who genuinely believed they were offering him something. The world, organised according to his values, running toward outcomes that matched his vision of what human life could be, sometimes with calculation, by people who wanted him to take the throne so that they could operate in the space that a world ruler needs to manage. Sometimes with the quiet desperation of someone who had simply run out of other ideas and was placing a last hope in the one being on the planet capable of things that seemed like miracles, he declined. Every time. Without hesitation, and without condescension, and without the kind of self-righteous performance that would have made the declination easier to dismiss. He simply said no, and explained why, and meant it. The explanation he gave varied in its language depending on the conversation, but its core was always the same. The problem with the world is not that it needs a better ruler. The problem with the world is that the idea of rule itself is the wrong solution to the things that are actually wrong. You cannot impose a good outcome. The outcome has to be arrived at, chosen, built from inside the communities and institutions that will have to sustain it. Anything else is temporary. Anything else collapses the moment the ruler's attention turns elsewhere. There is a philosophical sophistication in this position that is easy to underestimate. He is not saying he lacks the power. He is not saying the world doesn't need improvement. He is saying that the mechanism matters, that the difference between a good outcome imposed by an invincible being and a good outcome achieved through the slow, contentious, imperfect processes of human self-governance is not a difference of degree but a difference of kind. The second type of good outcome belongs to the people who made it. The first type is a gift that creates dependence, and dependence on the continued goodwill of the most powerful being alive is the most fragile possible foundation for a civilization. Sit with the weight of this choice. He looks at a world where things are going wrong, where people are suffering in ways that he could, with his specific capabilities, address directly. And he chooses not to override the systems that are failing them. He chooses to work within those systems, to push at their edges, to model possibility without replacing the processes that make human agency real. This is the hardest kind of restraint. It is the restraint that costs the most, because it means watching preventable suffering continue while the prevention remains physically available to him. It is the restraint that no one applauds, because it is invisible, because what you see is not a hero acting, but a hero not acting, and the reasons for the not acting require more patience to understand than the acting does. There have been versions of him, in the most difficult corners of the story, who made different choices, who looked at the suffering and the futility of waiting, and the inadequacy of the human systems and the ongoing cost of the restraint, and who decided that enough was enough. The most famous of these is the version that emerged from grief, specifically from a particular and catastrophic loss that we will come to in full. That version of him did take control. He reorganized global security. He eliminated certain categories of threat. He saved more lives measurably than the restrained version had, and he became something that the people who cared about him recognized as a warning, not a solution. What changed in him was not capability, and not even intention in the narrow sense. What changed was the relationship between his values and his methods. He still believed in the good outcome. He still wanted the things he had always wanted: safety, flourishing, the particular brightness of a world where people got to live full lives without catastrophic interruption. What shifted was his belief in whether the methods had to match the values. He had concluded, under sufficient pressure after sufficient loss, that the ends could justify the means, that a good enough outcome was worth the wrong kind of path to reach it. And in that conclusion, the thing that had always been the most dangerous element of him, the power, lost the one governor that had kept it pointed correctly. Batman saw it before it was fully visible. This is what the contingency plans were for. Not paranoia, not distrust. preparation for the most specific and most consequential possible failure mode. And when the failure began, Bruce Wayne did the thing that only someone who genuinely loved the man inside the symbol could do. He refused to look away from it. He did not celebrate being right. He did not use the kryptonite without grief. He confronted what his friend had become with the full awareness of what it would cost both of them, and he did not stop until the confrontation was complete. The path back from that version is one of the story's most important movements, and also one of its least celebrated. The return to restraint, after the period of control, after the world had been reorganized according to his decisions, after the short-term metrics showed improvement, was not dramatic. It was not a single moment of realization. It was a slow re-understanding, arrived at through the voices of people who had not stopped telling him the truth, even when the truth was politically and physically dangerous to say. It was Diana's clarity. It was the Kent's memory, carried inside him like a compass. It was eventually his own recognition that the face in the mirror had become unrecognizable. The return to restraint was harder than taking control had been. Taking control required only the abandonment of a principle. Returning to restraint required the rebuilding of it, from inside a situation where the principle had already been visibly violated, where trust had been spent, where the symbol had acquired a shadow it had never carried before. It required him to demonstrate over time through choices made in conditions where the old choice remained permanently available, that the architecture had been rebuilt, that it was genuine, that it would hold. He did this, not quickly, and not without cost, but he did it. And the doing of it, the willingness to accept the scrutiny, the doubt, the reduced trust, the conditional rehabilitation, was in some ways the most impressive thing he had ever done. Because the first time he chose restraint, he had been choosing it from a position of innocence, from a baseline of values established before the hardest tests. The second time, he chose it with the full knowledge of what the alternative felt like, what it could achieve, what it cost to abandon it. The second choice was informed in a way the first had not been. That makes it, arguably, the more meaningful one. There is a lesson in this about power and its relationship to accountability that extends far beyond his specific situation. The people most capable of changing the world by force are not made safer by the fact that their intentions are good. They are made safer, the world is made safer, only by their continuous chosen costly commitment to methods that preserve the agency of the people they intend to help. Intention without method is not virtue. Method matters. Process matters. The willingness to take the longer, harder, more uncertain path, because it is the path that leaves the destination genuinely belonging to the people who arrive there. That is what the restraint is for. His refusal to rule is, therefore, not a limitation. It is the central expression of what he values. A being who could do anything, and chooses to do only what is asked of him, only what is needed, only what leaves the world more capable of its own governance rather than more dependent on his. That being is not holding back. That being is at full expression of the thing that makes them worth the power they carry. The Kandorian question was one of the longest-running and most painful consequences of his existence. A city of Kryptonian survivors, miniaturized by Brainiac and contained within a bottle, representing the only other Kryptonian life he had known about for a significant portion of his adult life. The complexity of his relationship with Kandor was the complexity of someone who was simultaneously their champion and their jailer, who wanted nothing more than to restore them to full size and full freedom, and who could not accomplish this without risking consequences that the Kandorians themselves, in their miniaturized city, debated as fiercely as any political population debates anything. He visited when he could. He carried the bottle with the particular carefulness of someone who understood exactly what it contained. The United Nations had, by a certain point in his career, created a formal liaison position for communication with him. This was not his idea and not something he had sought, but he engaged with it with the seriousness it deserved, because the alternative to formal engagement was informal engagement, and informal engagement with global institutions produces outcomes that are harder to hold accountable. He appeared before the General Assembly twice. The first time, he spoke about the kinds of threats that international cooperation could address more effectively than individual response. Not the physical threats, which were his domain, but the systemic ones, the slow-moving catastrophes that required collective political will and sustained institutional attention. He did not tell them what to do. He told them what he saw from above, which is a view that ground-level governance rarely has access to. His occasional collaborations with the scientific community were among the more productive contributions he made to human civilization outside the direct prevention of catastrophe. He had access to knowledge about Kryptonian science, about the specific experience of operating in environments that no human could survive, that had no other pathway into human research traditions. He shared what he could, carefully, with attention to the ways that certain knowledge could be misused before the ethical frameworks for managing it were developed. He was more conservative about this than some scientists wanted him to be. He was less conservative than others thought he should be. He occupied the uncomfortable middle ground that all decisions about the pace of knowledge transfer occupy, where the cost of too much speed and the cost of too much caution are both real and neither is obviously smaller than the other. There were proposals at various points in the political history of the world he had helped protect to incorporate his capabilities into formal governance structures, to give him a vote in the Security Council, to establish a treaty framework that defined his obligations and rights as a kind of non-national entity with global standing. He declined all of them. Not because he was uninterested in accountability, he was actively interested in it, but because formal political incorporation would have resolved a productive ambiguity that he thought was worth maintaining. His lack of formal standing created a kind of freedom to operate across political boundaries that formal standing would have eliminated. He was nobody's and everybody's simultaneously. The ambiguity was uncomfortable for everyone involved, including him. He thought it was the right kind of discomfort. The breath is slower now. The weight of this segment has been real. The difficult versions, the failure and the return, the ongoing nature of a choice that must be remade in every moment. But what remains underneath all of it is something steady and worth resting in. The recognition that he chose, again and again, to be trustworthy. Not because he had to, because he understood why it mattered. Let that settle into whatever quiet is available to you now. Let the body settle a little more. If there is tension anywhere, in the jaw, the shoulders, the hands, let it release slowly, like a fist unclenching in slow motion. You are safe here. The story continues and it will carry you the rest of the way. Krypton's destruction produced something that should not exist. When a planet dies, when the geological catastrophe that Jor-El had calculated and the Science Council had refused to believe finally arrived, the explosive force of the planetary death scattered material across an enormous volume of space. Rock, atmosphere, ocean, all of it flung outward at velocities that no naturally occurring event had ever produced in that solar system. Most of it dispersed, became part of the slow drift of interstellar debris that takes millions of years to move significant distances. Some of it, propelled by specific dynamics of the explosion, travelled faster and farther. Some of it eventually reached Earth. The mineral material of Krypton, irradiated by the specific energies of its destruction, underwent a transformation during its long transit through space. The radiation it carried was not the clean solar radiation that fueled his cells, but something different. A radiation that interfered with the solar absorption process rather than enabling it, that disrupted the specific biological mechanisms that had developed over millennia of Kryptonian evolution under a different sun. When this material, glowing green with an energy that had no natural counterpart on Earth, came into proximity with him, the effect was immediate and profound. The cells that had been running at extraordinary capacity began to fail. The systems that no external force had been able to compromise began to compromise from inside. It hurt. This is something the clinical descriptions leave out. Kryptonite is not a power-off switch that operates cleanly and neutrally. It causes genuine physical suffering, the kind of pain that is difficult to endure and impossible to ignore, that narrows attention to the pain itself, that makes the clarity necessary for complex decisions progressively harder to maintain. He has been in the presence of it enough times to know this in detail. There is no adaptation to it, no building of tolerance. Each exposure is as difficult as the first. The cells do not learn to ignore the interference, they simply continue to respond to it as what it is, the radiation of the world that made them, transformed by catastrophe into something that unmakes them. The philosophical dimension of kryptonite is this. It is the only thing on Earth that connects him to his origin. Every piece of it is a piece of Krypton. Every glowing fragment is, in the most literal sense, the remains of the civilization that produced him, the streets and buildings and accumulated material of a world that no longer exists anywhere except in these scattered fragments and in him. The thing that most weakens him is the closest thing he has to a home. The universe has a dark sense of irony, or perhaps no sense of irony at all, and simply operates without regard for the poetry of its arrangements. He has allowed people to know about kryptonite. This is a choice that deserves careful attention, because it was not forced. He was not discovered holding the weakness, did not have it extracted from him by adversaries. He disclosed it, deliberately, to people he trusted and to the broader public through those people. He did this for the same reason he submitted to oversight and accepted accountability, because a being that is known to have a vulnerability is more trustworthy than a being that claims to have none. The vulnerability, made known, is a form of accountability. It says, I can be checked, I can be stopped, if what I am doing requires stopping. You are not without recourse. Batman holds kryptonite. This is one of the most analysed relationships in the story, and the analysis is usually focused on the wrong question. People ask whether it is a betrayal of trust, whether Superman was right to allow it, whether Batman was right to keep it. These questions miss the real content of the situation. The real content is that Superman gave Batman the means to stop him, and Batman accepted the responsibility of being the one who might have to use it, and both of them understood that this arrangement was the foundation of their partnership rather than a crack in it. The trust was not expressed by giving Batman nothing. The trust was expressed by giving him the one thing that mattered. Magic is the other domain in which his invulnerability does not apply, and it is less understood than kryptonite because it is less material, less graspable, less amenable to the kind of analysis that produces clear conclusions. The short version is this. His cells were calibrated in a universe that did not include Earth's magical traditions, the specific energies that certain practitioners have learned to access and shape. His body has no defense against these energies because it was never exposed to them during the millions of years of Kryptonian biological development. Magic reaches him in a way that most physical force cannot, not because it is inherently more powerful, but because it operates on a frequency his defenses were not built to address. He's been humbled by this, by magicians and sorcerers and beings of genuinely supernatural capability who found, to their own surprise, that the creature everyone else feared was surprisingly accessible through the right kind of working. He does not pretend this is not true. He has sought out people who understand magical systems well enough to help him understand where his exposure is greatest. He has accepted their assistance without the ego that might, in a lesser person, resist the acknowledgement of limitation. He approaches his own vulnerability with the same intellectual curiosity he brings to other problems, as information, not humiliation. The existence of these vulnerabilities, and the existence of beings on Earth who are in various ways his physical peers or his superiors in specific domains, has a clarifying effect on the question of what he actually is. He is not invincible. He is extraordinarily capable in specific ways under specific conditions. The extraordinary capability has a shape. It is strong where yellow solar radiation has been building cellular capacity, and it is weak where the Kryptonian biology was simply never prepared, never adapted, never equipped by the long history of its evolution. He is the product of a specific history, not an abstract ideal of power. The specific history has edges. Wonder Woman, in direct physical comparison, is his equal and arguably his superior in certain combat metrics. She has been forged by millennia of warrior training, carries the blessing of divine parentage, and operates from a fighting intelligence developed in contexts that make his Kansas upbringing look structurally naive. In a pure combat scenario, the outcome between them is genuinely uncertain. He finds this reassuring rather than threatening. It means that if he ever needed to be stopped, she could do it. The same logic applies to his acceptance of Batman's kryptonite. Being stoppable is the feature, not the flaw. The green glow of kryptonite has become, in the story's iconography, one of its most resonant images, precisely because of what it represents beyond the practical. It represents the persistence of origin. The way the world that made you continues to affect you long after you have left it, long after it no longer exists. The things that shaped you in your earliest formation carry forward through time, not always as strengths, sometimes as vulnerabilities, sometimes as both simultaneously. Kryptonite is Krypton. His weakness is his home. He carries both of them with him wherever he goes, and the carrying is complicated in ways that cannot be simplified without losing something true. There is an experience in this that is not unique to him. You carry things from the places that made you, the early experiences, the formative relationships, the environments that shaped your nervous system, before you had any say in the shaping. They are present in you, influencing your responses to things that happen now. Some of what they gave you is strength. Some of what they gave you creates difficulty in context that a different history would have navigated more easily. This is not a flaw in the architecture of a self. It is simply what it means to have been made somewhere, by something, before the making was finished. His willingness to acknowledge his vulnerabilities, to allow others to know them, and to hold the means of using them, is the clearest possible expression of something that the symbol on his chest tries to say in more abstract terms. The power that does not acknowledge its own limits is the power that cannot be trusted. The power that says, explicitly, here is how you can stop me if you need to. That power has made itself trustworthy in a way that no amount of demonstrated goodness alone could achieve. It has put something real in the relationship rather than simply asking to be believed. There is a specific frequency of sound that he associates with kryptonite, independent of the visual signal. The radiation interacts with the air in a way that produces something just at the edge of perception, not quite audible to human ears, but within the range that his enhanced hearing can detect at moderate distances. He became aware of this gradually, through accumulated experience, and it functions now as an early warning system, a way of knowing what is nearby before he is close enough to feel the effects. This knowledge has saved him from ambushes. It has also given him the slightly vertiginous experience of being able to hear the presence of his own destroyed world, the sound of Krypton's remnants, persistent in the universe long after Krypton itself is gone. Red sun radiation devices, artificial recreations of the specific wavelength emitted by a red dwarf star, engineered by people who had studied his biology carefully enough to understand what to replicate, represented a different category of vulnerability than kryptonite. Where kryptonite actively harms his cells, red sun radiation simply removes the input that powers them, leaving a biology that was calibrated for red sun conditions operating in those conditions at baseline. The effect is not painful in the way that kryptonite is painful. It is simply depowering, a progressive return to what he would have been under Krypton's sky, capable and intelligent and determined but physically finite, in the way that all finite beings are physical. His relationship with the Green Lantern Corps, the interplanetary police force operating under the authority of the Guardians of Oa, was one of the story's more interesting diplomatic complications. The Corps had jurisdiction that technically extended to Earth. They had representatives who had made clear at various points that an entity with his capabilities operating on a planet without formal membership in the interplanetary community was something that the Guardians monitored with interest. He had met with Hal Jordan, the Green Lantern most directly responsible for his sector, and the conversations between them were among the more substantive geopolitical discussions of his career, because they were conducted between two beings who both operated at extraordinary capability and who had both worked out through experience rather than theory what responsible operation at that capability level required. The lead lining of certain structures, basements, vaults, rooms in which particular privacy was required, represented a kind of architectural accommodation to his existence that had become normalized in certain circles. If you wanted a space he could not see into, you lined it with lead. He found this reasonable, he approved of it explicitly, because it was exactly the kind of environmental design that preserved human agency over their own spaces without requiring his cooperation or his voluntary restraint. The lead did the governance rather than requiring him to self-govern. External checks were more reliable than internal ones in the long run. He was glad people had found a way to build them into walls. Let the breath flow through that now. The vulnerability is not a weakness in the story. It is one of the story's most important truths. What makes him safe, genuinely structurally safe, is not that he is invincible. It is that he is not, and that he knows it, and that he has allowed the knowledge to be shared. Rest in that. The strength and the fragility belong to the same being. They always have. Breathe in and out. There is a quality to the quiet at this hour, wherever you are in the world, whatever time the clock says, that is specific and valuable. It is the quiet of things having settled. The noise of the day has thinned. The urgency that makes everything feel immediate has receded. Let the receding happen fully now, and follow the story into one of its most important chapters. Every story that has lasted has a worse day in it. The moment when the protagonist encounters something that their capabilities, their values, their preparation, their relationships, none of it is sufficient to prevent. The moment that defines not who they are when things are manageable, but who they are when they are not. For Clark Kent, the worst days have come in several forms, and each one has taught him something that no amount of success could have taught him. The most important of these lessons involves the nature of grief, and what grief, if it is not moved through, does to someone who contains the power he contains. Doomsday arrived without context or explanation. This is important. The story of that conflict does not begin with a villain's plan or a comprehensible objective or any of the narrative architecture that makes most threats processable. It was simply destruction given a body, an extinction-level physical force in the form of something that should not have existed but did, something that had been engineered by the universe's most pessimistic logic to be the last thing standing. The fight moved through Metropolis with an impact that left the city fundamentally altered. Not destroyed, not emptied, but marked in the way that places are marked by events that exceeded anything they were built to contain. He died. In that version, in that telling, he died. The physical cost of stopping what Doomsday was exceeded what his body could sustain. The solar reserves, pushed to their limit through a fight that had lasted beyond any previous endurance, depleted. The cells that had been running at extraordinary capacity for hours of sustained maximum effort could not continue, and when they stopped, he stopped. In the arms of a woman who loved him, in the ruins of a city that would erect statues to what he had done, his body went still. For a time, there was no Superman. The world experienced his absence in a way that was instructive about what his presence had actually meant. Not just the practical absence, the times when something happened that he would have addressed, and no one addressed it, the gap where his intervention would have been, but the symbolic absence. The symbol on people's minds suddenly carried a past tense. Something they had organized their sense of the possible around was no longer operating. The recalibration this required was not comfortable. It surfaced in many people the awareness of how much weight they had placed on the assumption of his continued existence, without ever fully acknowledging they had placed it there. He came back. The specific mechanics of this, the Kryptonian cell regeneration that occurred under extended exposure to solar radiation in a state of apparent death, the slow return of biological function, are less important than what the return required of him psychologically. Because the world he returned to had continued without him, and its continuation had changed things. People had made decisions in his absence. Other figures had stepped into certain spaces. The grief of the people who had lost him had been moving through its stages, and some of them had arrived at places the grief had taken them that his return did not simply undo. Lois had been grieving. This requires its own careful attention, because Lois Lane's grief is not a minor emotional note in the story. It is one of the story's most serious claims about what love costs when it is given to someone who lives in the conditions he lives in. She had known, in the abstract, that his existence was dangerous. She had understood, intellectually, that the work he did created risks that were not manageable in the way that ordinary occupational risk is manageable. But knowing a thing abstractly and experiencing its concrete arrival are very different. She had experienced it, and the person who came back to her was the person she loved. But he was also coming back into a relationship that had been taken apart by loss and was not yet rebuilt. His return to Metropolis, to the Daily Planet, to the rhythms of Clark Kent's life, all of it required a kind of patience and humility that his physical resurrection did not automatically provide. The body came back. The rest had to be re-earned. This is one of the story's quieter wisdoms, that recovery from the worst things is not simply a matter of the worst thing ending. The ending of the worst thing is the beginning of the work that the worst thing created. He could not return and expect everything to resume. He had to show up for the resumption and do the work of making it real. Pause here for a moment. Think about the worst days in your own story, not to dwell in them, but to recognize something about what they revealed. The worst days are the days that showed you what you were made of, not in the triumphant sense, but in the honest sense. They showed you where your foundations held and where they gave way. They showed you which relationships were built on something real and which were built on conditions that the worst day removed. They are expensive teachers, but they are teachers, and what they teach tends to stay. His experience of mortality, of actually dying, of having the limits of his physical capacity demonstrated in the most complete possible way, changed his relationship to the permanence he had perhaps unconsciously assumed. Before Doomsday, there had been a quality to his presence in the world that was similar to the quality of a permanent feature, something that had always been there and would always be there, like a mountain or a tide. After, that quality was gone. He knew now, in the way that you only know things you have experienced rather than reasoned toward, that he was not permanent. He was here and he was alive, and those were the same fragile conditions that every other living thing on this planet navigated. He had simply had the unusual experience of having the fragility demonstrated and surviving the demonstration. The city mourned him and then celebrated his return, and then gradually, over time, integrated both experiences into its collective memory of him in a way that was more complete and more honest than the pre-Doomsday version had been. Metropolis had known Superman as someone extraordinary. After, it knew him as someone extraordinary who had been mortal, who had died and come back, who was not invincible in the absolute sense. This knowledge changed the texture of the trust, made it more specific, more informed, less dependent on a fantasy of the impossible. He was what he was, not what they had needed to imagine. That turned out to be more than enough. The scar that the experience left in him was not visible on his body, which recovered completely under the solar restoration. The scar was in his relationship to time. He began, after, to feel the passing of days differently, with a greater awareness of what was in them, what they contained, what they would not contain again once they were past. He paid more attention. He was present in a more deliberate way. The small things that constitute a life, the conversations, the meals, the ordinary mornings in an ordinary apartment, with extraordinary sensory access to an entire city's worth of sound and light, began to register with a weight they had not quite carried before. Jonathan Kent's death had prepared him for this, in the way that the early losses prepare us for the later ones, not by making the later ones easier, but by teaching the nervous system that loss is survivable, that grief is a passage and not a destination, that the person you are on the other side of a significant loss is not a diminished version of the person you were before, but a different, more complete version. Jonathan had died of a heart attack, not a villain, not a catastrophe, just the ordinary mechanism of a body at the end of its capacity. And Clark had not been able to stop it. Had been there, near enough, fast enough, capable in every way except the one that mattered, and had not been able to stop it. That was the first lesson in the limits of power. Doomsday was the second. Both were necessary. He carries the dead with him, not as a burden exactly and not as a haunting, but as a presence, the specific gravity of the people who shaped him and are no longer present in the physical world. Jonathan, Krypton's billions, the people he arrived too late to save in the years of active work. They are in him the way his origin is in him, not accessible to direct examination but structurally present, part of the architecture of his choices and his values and the specific quality of his attention when attention matters most. The period of his death was experienced differently by different people who had known him in different registers of his existence. For the people of Metropolis, it was a civic grief, the kind that attaches to institutions and landmarks when they are damaged or lost, the recognition that something that had defined the character of a place was gone. For the Justice League, still forming at that point, still working out what the alliance was and what it required, it was a test of whether the thing they were building could survive the loss of its most capable member. For Lois, it was the kind of loss that does not fit into public vocabulary, and therefore gets carried in silence. The four figures who attempted to fill the role in his absence, each carrying a version of the symbol, each representing a different theory of what the role required, told the story of what the role actually meant through the specific ways they could not sustain it. The Eradicator brought Kryptonian values without Kryptonian upbringing, which meant the values were present but without the specifically human softening that the Kents had provided. Steel brought the engineering intelligence and the moral commitment, but not the physical capability that made certain interventions possible. Superboy brought the raw power and the genuine desire, but not the decades of cultivated judgment that made the power trustworthy. Cyborg Superman brought none of what the symbol represented except its image. Together they outlined the shape of what was absent more clearly than any description could. Martha Kent's experience of her son's death and return is one of the story's most quietly devastating threads, treated with the brevity that the story often brings to the emotional experience of the people in the background of his narrative. She had buried a child. She had made the specific adjustments that the loss of a child requires, the reorganization of expectation, the revision of the future, the particular way that daily life becomes both heavier and emptier. And then he had come back. The coming back required its own adjustment, equally profound and considerably less discussed in the formal record. She had sat in the kitchen of the farmhouse with him the first time he came home after his return, and she had held his face in her hands for a long moment, and she had not said anything, because there was nothing to say that the holding did not say more completely. The economic disruption that followed his death was smaller than might have been expected, which was itself a data point about what his presence had and had not provided. The systems that his interventions had supplemented, emergency response, disaster mitigation, certain categories of security infrastructure, continued, imperfectly but continuously, because they had not been entirely replaced by his capability. He had been, in those domains, an extraordinary supplement to existing capacity rather than a replacement of it. This was partly a consequence of the restraint architecture, of his deliberate policy of supporting rather than supplanting human institutional capability. The systems, designed and operated by humans for human-scale needs, kept functioning when the extraordinary supplement was gone. He noted this with something he recognized as satisfaction. The worst days are also the most honest days. They strip away what is performed and leave only what is real. What was real in him, when the testing was complete, when doomsday was over and the grief had moved through and the return had been accomplished, and the ordinary days resumed, was the same as what had been real in the farm boy in Kansas who had discovered his own strangeness and not been destroyed by it. The same patience, the same orientation toward the light, the same basic refusal to conclude that the world was not worth protecting. The worst day had confirmed rather than contradicted the thing that the Kents had built. Rest in that confirmation now. Let the breath arrive naturally. There is no particular rhythm required, just the body's own timing, which is wiser than any instruction. Follow it down into the next layer of quiet. The story continues. The Justice League was not planned. This is one of those facts that retrospective accounts tend to smooth over, inserting a narrative coherence that was not present in the actual development. What actually happened was a series of crises that each exceeded the capacity of any individual to address, and a gradually accumulating awareness among the people involved that something different was necessary. Not a better individual, but a configuration of individuals that could address what individuals could not. The League did not arise from philosophy. It arose from necessity, shaped afterward by philosophy. His role in it was complicated from the beginning, and the complication was not about loyalty or commitment. Those were never in question. The complication was structural. He was categorically different from every other member of the founding group in a way that created dynamics that required continuous and careful management. Barry Allen was fast. Diana was a warrior of extraordinary capability. Bruce was the most prepared human being alive. Arthur could command the ocean. Each of them was remarkable. None of them could do what he could do. The gap between his capability and the next person in the group was not a small gap. It was the kind of gap that, if not managed thoughtfully, reshapes every collaborative structure it is embedded in. He managed it by consistently subordinating his own tactical assessments to the group's process. Not because his assessments were wrong, they were frequently the most accurate in the room, but because the practice of subordination was itself necessary for the group's functioning. A team in which one member's capabilities are so dominant that their judgment is always deferred to is not a team. It is a hierarchy with a very thin layer of collaborative performance spread over it. He understood this and actively worked against the dynamic his own existence created. He asked for others' assessments. He accepted when the group overruled him. He treated the process of collective decision-making as genuinely valuable, rather than as an obstacle to the fastest route to the right answer. Diana was the one who named this behaviour most clearly, in one of the rare conversations they had about the internal dynamics of the group, rather than about the work itself. She told him that what he was doing, the deliberate minimization of his own structural dominance, was one of the most sophisticated forms of leadership she had encountered across her long experience with groups organized around exceptional individuals, that leading by stepping back, by creating space, by insisting that the process be real rather than performative, was a skill that very few people with his capabilities had ever bothered to develop. She had seen it fail, seen leaders of extraordinary ability simply assume that their ability entitled them to the final word, far more often than she had seen it succeed. Barry Allen brought a different kind of perspective. Barry understood, in a way that rhymed with his own experience, what it was like to move through a world that was operating at a slower speed than you were capable of. The particular isolation of it, the daily discipline of matching your pace to people who could not match yours, the way that isolation could either make you contemptuous or compassionate depending on the choices you made about what to do with it. They were friends in the particular way that people become friends when they recognize their own specific experience in someone else, not despite the differences, but through the specific similarities embedded within them. The watchtower, when it was built, was his idea. Not because he wanted a headquarters, he had never needed one, but because he understood that the group needed a space that was neutral in a specific way. Not Gotham, which carried all of Bruce's particular history and authority. Not Themyscira, which was Diana's home and sacred space. Not Metropolis, where his presence would have made everything about him. The orbit. The specific remove of being above the atmosphere, looking down at the full sphere of the world they were protecting. This, he argued, would give the group a perspective that no ground-based location could offer. He was right, and the rightness of it was not just practical but psychological. From orbit, the divisions that organized the world into competing territories became less visible. The whole was more present. This affected the quality of their thinking. The League's internal tensions were real and should not be minimized. There were philosophical disagreements that ran deep, between Bruce's absolute refusal to kill and Diana's warrior tradition, in which killing was sometimes the appropriate conclusion to a conflict. Between Barry's instinct toward optimism and Arthur's hard-edged pragmatism. Between his own commitment to human autonomy and the various other members' varying willingness to override that autonomy when the situation seemed to require it. He was often the person who held the middle of these disagreements, not because he had no strong views, but because he understood that his views, given the weight that his capabilities lent them, needed to be offered carefully rather than pressed insistently. There were moments when this self-imposed restraint within the group was wrong. Moments when he should have pressed more, should have asserted more clearly, should have let the weight of his judgment fall where it was needed rather than pulling back from the asymmetry it created. The habit of restraint taken too far is its own form of abdication, a refusal to take responsibility for the influence you actually have in favour of the cleaner conscience of the one who did not interfere. He has had to learn the balance between the two. It is not a fixed point. It moves depending on the situation, and finding it each time requires judgment of a kind that no amount of physical power makes easier. Arthur Curry, Aquaman, represented something in the League that is easy to overlook from a land-based perspective. 70% of the Earth's surface is ocean. The ecosystems below that surface are more complex and more ancient than anything on land. The civilizations that developed in those depths, Atlantis being the most prominent, and not coincidentally one of the most technically advanced cultures on the planet, had been managing the affairs of the deep world for longer than human civilization had been managing anything. Arthur was the interface between those two worlds, and his membership in the League was the most significant diplomatic event in the relationship between surface and sea that had occurred in recorded history. He had worked to understand this. He had learned enough about Atlantean history and Atlantean politics and the specific character of Arthur's position, king of a people who had very reasonable historical grievances against the surface world, to engage with it seriously rather than superficially. The League could not function as a genuinely global institution if it was organised primarily around the concerns and perspectives of surface world humans. Incorporating Arthur's perspective required that the group do the harder work of understanding a world most of them had never lived in and could barely survive in without assistance. He pushed for this work to happen, consistently, over the objections of members who found it easier to focus on the more familiar. Cyborg, Victor Stone, came to the League as someone who was still in the process of understanding what he was, a person who had been changed without consent by circumstances that offered no alternative, and who was navigating the enormous psychological territory of being something genuinely new, while also trying to remain connected to who he had been. He understood this from his own history in a specific way. He did not pretend that his experience and Victor's were equivalent. They were not. But the shape of the navigation, the work of holding a continuous identity across a transformation that had changed the most fundamental facts of your existence, That shape was recognizable. The League at its best was a demonstration of something that the story is always arguing for but rarely gets to demonstrate directly. That extraordinary individuals with incompatible capabilities and genuine disagreements can organize themselves around shared commitments in a way that is more effective than any of them operating alone, and that the process of doing this, the negotiation, the friction, the ongoing maintenance of the collaborative structure, is not a cost of having the League. It is the League. The thing that makes it worth having is not the sum of the individual capabilities. It is the quality of the relationships between them. He has said, when pressed, that the most important things the League has accomplished are not the largest threats addressed or the most dramatic saves. They are the smaller things, the shifts in what the world believes is possible when different kinds of extraordinary people are visibly committed to each other across their differences. The seeing of it matters. People watch the League and update their sense of what cooperation looks like, what trust between very different individuals can accomplish, what the world might look like if the things that divide people were navigated with the same seriousness as the threats that require them to work together. The question of the League's official legal status occupied a remarkable amount of the group's administrative attention in its early years, more than any of them had anticipated when the formation was happening under the pressure of immediate crisis. They were not a government agency. They were not a non-governmental organisation in any existing legal sense. They were not a military unit, though several of their members had formal military affiliations. They occupied a category that the existing legal frameworks had not anticipated and were not equipped to process, and the resolution of this, the slow, contested, incomplete process of establishing what the League was and what it could do, and under whose authority it operated, consumed years of negotiation with entities that range from the United Nations to individual national governments to the governments of non-surface nations whose existence the surface world officially declined to acknowledge. The internal communication systems that Victor Stone developed for the League were one of the most significant practical contributions to the group's functioning, not because communication had been impossible before, but because Victor understood from his specific hybrid experience of being simultaneously biological and technological what the barriers to genuine communication between very different kinds of minds actually were. He designed systems that could transmit across the sensory range differences between members, that could communicate urgent information to someone whose primary sensory mode was echolocation, or to someone whose environmental conditions at any given moment might be the bottom of the ocean, or to someone moving at speeds that made conventional signal transmission a timing problem. The systems worked because their designer knew the problem from the inside. The Watchtower's library was his contribution, a collection of materials that was less library in the human institutional sense and more curated archive of the things he thought a group like theirs needed access to in order to make good decisions. History, primarily. The long record of how similar concentrations of capability had been organised in the past, what had worked, what had failed, what the failures had produced. He was particularly interested in the examples of failure, because the examples of success tended to record the outcome while obscuring the process, while the examples of failure often preserved, in their very catastrophe, a clearer picture of the decisions that had produced them. He wanted the League to have access to those decisions. He wanted them to know what had gone wrong before. The relationship between the League and the governments of the world it protected was never stable, in the sense that stable implies settled. It was more like a body of water that finds its level continuously, not fixed, but not random either, constrained by the shape of the container even as the container's shape was itself gradually altered by the weight of the water. Governments wanted oversight. The League required operational independence. The negotiation of this tension produced a set of informal agreements and formal protocols that satisfied neither side completely and that continued to be renegotiated as the situations that revealed their inadequacies presented themselves. He participated in every round of this negotiation. He considered it one of the most important things the League did. Let the breath slow further now. The League is resting tonight. Or whatever the members of the League do when the crises have paused and the orbital vantage looks down at a quiet world. You are resting too. Let the image of that orbit, that clean view of the whole sphere below, remain with you as a kind of perspective on your own situation. The reminder that the view from high enough is always more complete, always shows the connections that the ground-level view obscures. Rest in that height for a moment before the story moves on. There is a quality to this hour, whatever hour it is for you, that belongs to the deepest part of the night. Not the beginning of night, not the end, but the middle, where everything has gone still and the world has temporarily released its grip on urgency. Rest there. The story is moving into its most serious chapter, and it asks only that you follow at the pace your breath sets. The thought experiment that haunts the story of Superman is not hypothetical. It has been told fully, with all its consequences and its logic laid bare. The question is, what happens if the thing that has always governed his power, the love, the values, the relationship to the people he is protecting, is removed by the worst possible method? Not corrupted gradually, not undermined by argument or ideology, but taken from him in a single moment of catastrophic, irreversible, deliberate loss. The Joker found the answer to this question and acted on it with the specific genius that makes him the most dangerous human being in the story, not in spite of his lack of physical power, but because of it. A being without physical capability positioned against the most powerful being on the planet has only one viable strategy: aim at what the power cannot protect. Not the body, which is invulnerable, not the allies, who are formidable. The thing the power cannot protect is the interior architecture that gives it direction. The grief, the love, the specific attachments that make the power meaningful rather than simply large. He lost Lois. In that telling, in that version, he lost her in a way that was engineered to also take the city. A trap that used his own love as the trigger. The Joker's calculation was not wrong, only miscalibrated about the direction of the consequence. He had expected the destruction of someone who had been operating as a hero to also destroy the heroism. What he could not have predicted, or perhaps could have predicted and found acceptable, was that what the loss actually destroyed was the restraint. The grief arrived all at once, in a form that has no adequate description. There is no precedent in human experience for losing the person you love while simultaneously understanding that the mechanism of the loss was specifically designed to undo you, that the grief is being weaponized before it has finished arriving. The speed of his responses, normally governed by a processing architecture that considered consequences before committing to action, briefly failed. Not completely, not permanently, long enough. He killed the Joker. In this version, he made that choice, which is the choice that Bruce Wayne had spent a lifetime refusing, that Diana's warrior tradition had placed within a carefully defined set of conditions, that his own values had always placed outside the available options. He made it, and the making of it was not a moment of weakness in the simple sense. It was a moment of a different kind of strength, the strength of someone who has decided that a specific calculation has changed. The Joker would not stop. Every system designed to contain him had failed and would continue to fail. The accounting of all future harm against the moral cost of this action produced a number that, in his grief, looked different than it had ever looked before. What followed was the version of him that the story calls Regime Superman, a name that carries the judgment the story has already reached about what he became. He reorganized the world's security architecture. He eliminated certain categories of threat with a finality that previous versions of him had always refused. He established a global peace, measurable, real, verifiable, by the only method he had concluded was reliable. The elimination of serious actors willing to disrupt it, enforced by the only being on the planet capable of enforcing it everywhere simultaneously. The metrics improved. Fewer people died in certain categories of conflict. The peace was real. and it was wrong. Not wrong in the way that mistakes are wrong in the way that contradictions are wrong, in the way that a true thing and its opposite cannot both be true. He had become, in the name of protecting people, the thing from which people needed protection. Not because his intentions had changed, they had not. Not because he had become cruel or indifferent, he had not. But because the method he had chosen to accomplish the good outcome was indistinguishable, in its structural effect, from tyranny. A world that could not resist the will of its ruler was not a world that had been protected. It was a world that had been captured. The ruler's goodness was irrelevant to this fact. Sit with this for a moment. Really sit with it, because it is the most important philosophical claim in the entire story. The quality of the ruler does not determine the quality of the system. A good ruler over a captured population is not the same as a governed population ruling itself, even if the specific outcomes in any given moment are better under the good ruler. The capacity for self-determination, the ability to make collective choices about collective life, even when those choices are wrong, even when they produce worse outcomes than the alternative, is not a luxury feature of governance. It is the thing that makes governance legitimate rather than simply imposed. He could not see this from inside the grief. This is the human thing in him, the thing the Kents gave him, making itself visible in its most costly form. The grief was real. The love that produced the grief was real. And real grief, hitting the specific psychology of someone who had always resolved difficulty through action, produced action of a kind that the grief's logic demanded, and his values' logic could not, in that moment, override. He was not calculating badly. He was calculating from inside a pain that changed what he was willing to count. Bruce saw it first. He always sees things first where the contingency plans are relevant. He saw what Kal-El had become, and he understood, with the sorrow of someone who had prepared for this, and found no comfort in the preparation, that the preparation was now necessary. The kryptonite came out, the confrontation happened, and it was not the confrontation of enemies. It was the confrontation of friends who were on opposite sides of the most important question the story asks. Whether the ends can justify the means when the ends are genuinely good and the means are genuinely terrible. The answer the story gives is no, emphatically, painfully, without sentimentality. The regime was dismantled, not in a moment. It took time, coalition, the combined effort of people from multiple configurations of the world's defenders and resistors, and the dismantling required him to participate in his own correction, to accept the restoration of the constraints he had removed, to acknowledge that the version of him that had emerged from grief was not an evolution but a deviation. This acknowledgement is, in the story's moral architecture, the most important moment, not the grief, not the choice, not even the dismantling, the acknowledgement. Because acknowledgement is what prevents the deviation from becoming permanent. A person who has done wrong and claims they were right condemns themselves to continuing the wrong. A person who has done wrong and acknowledges it genuinely without minimization or redirection has done the thing that makes repair possible. He acknowledged it. He said, without qualification, that what he had become was wrong, that the good outcomes did not redeem the method, that the people who had resisted him had been right to resist him. This acknowledgement cost him something real. The story he might have told himself about what the grief had required. He chose the truth over the story. The lesson the injustice theorem teaches is not that Superman is dangerous. It is that grief is powerful enough to undo even the most sustained and genuine commitment to restraint if the grief is severe enough and the person experiencing it has the physical capability to act on it without consequence. This is not a lesson about him specifically. It is a lesson about the relationship between emotional devastation and power in any form. Physical, institutional, financial, social. When power and grief combine in the wrong proportions, the result is the regime, in whatever form the specific power and the specific grief make possible. Understanding this is what makes contingency plans necessary, and what makes the existence of people willing to implement them valuable. The parallel Earth, the one from which the insurgency drew its most important strategic knowledge, was one of the stranger features of the injustice crisis, and one that reveals something important about what the story is actually arguing. The existence of an alternate version of events, a version in which the regime had not taken hold and the original values had been maintained, was not offered as comfort, as evidence that the good version was always possible. It was offered as contrast, as the clearest possible demonstration of the difference between the two paths, made visible by having both of them exist simultaneously in a form that could be compared directly. The alternate Superman, confronted with what his counterpart had become, experienced something that had no name, the grief of someone who has seen what they might have been if the worst thing had happened to them. Black Adam's response to the regime was clarifying in a way that few other responses were, because Black Adam's own history with power and its uses was long enough and complex enough to make his assessment authoritative in a specific way. He had been a tyrant. He had organised a nation around his own capability and his own judgment, and had maintained that organisation for centuries. He understood from the inside what regime rule felt like, what it produced in the people subject to it, what it did to the ruler over time, how the distance between the original justification and the current practice expanded gradually until the two had no meaningful relationship. His opposition to what the regime Superman had become was not ideological. It was experiential. He had been that, and he knew what it made of you. The question of what Lois Lane would have wanted, had she survived, had the catastrophe not occurred, had the Joker's calculation been disrupted before its conclusion, was one that the insurgency found itself discussing in unexpected moments. Because her voice, specifically, was the voice most likely to have reached him. The people who were trying to restore the original version of him were working against an absence that they could not fill, the absence of the one person whose relationship to him had always operated outside the normal channels of influence and argument and appeal. She had talked to him in a register that no one else had access to. Without her, the restoration was a longer path than it would otherwise have been. The children who grew up under the regime, who had no memory of the world before it, who had been born into a global peace maintained by an invincible guardian and understood this as the natural condition of human existence, represented one of the regime's most complicated legacies. They had experienced less catastrophic violence than any previous generation in recorded history. They had also grown up without a genuine understanding of what self-governance looked like, without the experience of collective decision-making and its consequences, without the particular kind of agency that develops in people who understand that the conditions of their lives are the result of choices that they and their communities make, rather than the benevolence of a being with infinite capability. Preparing them for a world in which that agency had been restored was one of the post-regime period's most serious and least glamorous tasks. You have travelled through the darkest part of the story now. Let the breath find its way back to something easier. The darkness is real. The story does not spare you from it, because an honest telling of what he is requires the honest telling of what he became and what it cost, and what it took to come back. But the coming back is also real. The acknowledgement is real. Rest in the completion of the circuit, the fall and the return, and let the next segment carry you toward the quiet end of this long night. The breath is very slow now. Let it be. The night has carried you a long distance, from a dying planet to a Kansas morning, through the architecture of restraint and the philosophy of vulnerability, through the worst days and the long return from them, through the league and the theorem and the hard acknowledgement of what grief can do to even the most sustained goodness. You are here now, at the quiet end. Let the last chapter arrive gently. Krypton made his biology, the yellow sun made his power, the Kents made his character, and Earth, the specific, complicated, perpetually unfinished project of Earth, made him into what he ultimately is, not an alien visitor, not a god in residence, not a power with a person attached to it, but a product of this world in the deepest possible sense. He is what this world produced when it got to shape something extraordinary. He is its best argument for what is possible, the question of identity, which has followed him through every version of this story, from the earliest telling to the most recent. is not actually a question of which name is real. Clark Kent is not a disguise. Superman is not a disguise. They are two aspects of the same continuous identity, organised around two different sets of social function and held together by the same interior life. The mild-mannered reporter and the being who moves faster than the eye can follow are the same person, thinking the same thoughts, caring about the same things, oriented by the same values toward the same purposes. The costume is not deception, it is translation. What Clark Kent gives him that Superman alone cannot provide is the texture of ordinary life, the experience of moving through the world at human pace, in human company, with human stakes attached to human interactions. The lunch conversations, the deadline pressures, the small daily negotiations of a shared workspace, the relationships with colleagues who know him as someone unexceptional and relate to him accordingly. These are not degraded versions of what he could be doing. They are the thing that keeps him calibrated, the daily reminder of what the scale of ordinary life feels like from the inside, which is the scale at which most human experience happens, and which his more extraordinary activities are ultimately in service of. Martha Kent is still alive, in most tellings. She's an elderly woman in a farmhouse in Kansas, living a life that is ordinary by every external measure, and she's the last living person who knew him before he knew himself, who saw him arrive, inexplicable and small and completely dependent, and chose to love him without condition or explanation. He visits when he can. He sits in the kitchen where he sat as a child, and lets the smell of the place and the sound of her voice do what those things do, return him temporarily to a version of himself that predates all the weight. He's not Clark Kent with her. He's not Superman. He's the child she kept, and that person exists inside all the other people he has become, intact, unchanged. The city of Metropolis has changed over the decades of his presence in it. Cities do change, but this city has changed in specific ways that are at least partially his influence. The research institutions that have grown around the technologies he has occasionally contributed to, the emergency response systems that were redesigned after studying how he manages disasters, the architectural adaptations that reflect a city that has learned to expect the extraordinary and build for it, the culture, harder to measure but visible if you know how to look, that is slightly more inclined toward the belief that problems can be solved, because it has watched problems being solved in ways that should not have been possible. He is aware that his presence has made the city dependent in ways that are not entirely healthy. He has thought about this carefully, the way he thinks about all the structural consequences of his existence. A city that has grown accustomed to someone who can prevent certain categories of disaster will, over time, underinvest in its own capacity to prevent them. The infrastructure, the planning, the institutional preparation, these are less developed than they would be in a city that had never had access to him. He has tried to compensate for this by actively supporting the development of independent human capacity in the areas where his presence creates the most dependence. It is incomplete work. The dependence is real and will not be fully resolved in his lifetime or anyone else's. His relationship with humanity has the quality of the best long relationships, the ones that have survived difficulty and change and the ordinary erosion of time, the ones that have accumulated enough shared history to have developed a richness that new relationships cannot replicate. He has been here long enough to have watched the people he first knew grow old and die, long enough to have watched their children take their places and their children after them, long enough to understand, in a way that only very long presence can teach, that what he is witnessing is not a series of individual stories, but the ongoing project of a species working out, generation by generation, what it means to exist together on a small planet with limited resources and unlimited capacity for both destruction and creation. He does not have unlimited time. This is less clear in the story than it should be, and it is worth being explicit about it. Kryptonians under a yellow sun age more slowly than humans, much more slowly, by an order of magnitude that makes the comparison difficult to calibrate precisely. But they are not immortal. They are a long-lived species operating at the extreme end of what biology permits. He will eventually grow old. He will eventually stop. The world he is protecting will continue after him, and it will have to continue without him, and he knows this. He has known it for a long time, and the knowing has shaped the work in a specific way. He's not simply doing the work. He's trying to leave the world more capable of doing the work itself. This is the deepest version of the argument against rule. He's not refusing to rule because he does not want to, or because he does not think he could do it well. He's refusing to rule because rule, even good rule, is not the same as development. And development, the growth of human capacity for self-governance, self-protection, self-determined flourishing, is the only form of progress that will continue after he's no longer here to sustain it. He's building toward his own irrelevance, deliberately, as the highest expression of the values that the Kents gave him. He wants the world to not need him. He wants the protection to be internal, distributed, owned by the people who inhabit the world. He is in this light not a guardian but a teacher. Not a shield, but a demonstration of what a shield can look like, offered to a world that is learning to build its own. The dangerous thing about him was never the power. The dangerous thing was always the question of what the power was pointed at, which is a question of character rather than capability. And the answer to that question, the answer that every version of the story has returned to, through the tests and the failures and the recoveries and the long, ordinary work, is that it has been pointed consistently and genuinely at the flourishing of people who are not him, at the continuation of lives that depend on conditions he can maintain, at the stubborn, renewable belief that the next morning is worth protecting, because someone will wake into it and need the morning to be there. The most dangerous being on earth chose, every day, to be the safest thing in the room. That choice was not made once, at the beginning, in a single moment of moral clarity. It was made continuously, in the specific conditions of each day, against the specific pressures of each situation, at the specific cost that each renewal of the choice extracted. It was maintained through grief and failure and the darkest version of what he could become. It was rebuilt when it failed. It was carried forward, imperfect and genuine, because the alternative, the abandonment of it, was something he could not justify to the faces he carried inside him. Let the breath slow to its most natural pace now. The story has reached its quiet end. Not a conclusion, because stories like this do not conclude. They continue tomorrow, in the next choice he makes and the next thing the world presents him with, and the next person who looks up and sees the symbol and feels the particular kind of safety that it has always been trying to offer. But the telling is complete. You have the whole shape of it now, the origin and the power, the architecture of restraint and its testing, the league and the failure and the long return, the ordinary mornings in a Kansas kitchen that make all the rest of it possible. Somewhere above you, above the ceiling, above the roof, above the atmosphere, the orbit continues. The watch is maintained. The world turns in its slow rotation, and the morning is coming, as it always comes, reliable and indifferent to whatever the night contained. You have been safe this entire time. You were always going to be safe. The story knew that. You can let the knowing settle now, into whatever rest is available to you, into the quiet that follows when a long and honest thing has been told completely. The archive that Jor-El embedded in the rocket, the artificial intelligence that carried his voice and his knowledge, that greeted Kal-El in the fortress and became his closest connection to a world that no longer existed, was not a complete record of Krypton. This is something he had understood gradually and with a specific quality of grief. The archive was a selection, the things Jor-El had considered most important, most worth preserving, most likely to be useful to a child growing up on an alien world. It was, inevitably, the selection of one person, made under conditions of extreme time pressure, shaped by one person's values and priorities and knowledge. It was the best of Krypton as Jor-El understood it. It was not all of Krypton. The streets he never walked, the conversations he never heard, the lives that were not part of his scientific circle. These were gone without record. His relationship to aging is a question the story has addressed differently at different moments and never fully resolved. Under the yellow sun, his cellular regeneration operates at a rate that dramatically slows the processes that constitute aging in biological terms. He ages, but slowly enough that the human timescale does not capture it in any single human lifetime. The people who know him watch themselves age while he does not, and this asymmetry, familiar from myths about immortals moving through the mortal world, is one of the quiet costs of the relationships he builds. He has thought about this. He has accepted it in the way that all genuine acceptance of unresolvable things operates, not with contentment, but with the recognition that the alternative is to not build relationships, which is a cost he is not willing to pay. The Superboy who eventually took on the name, the biological construct whose origins were complicated, and whose path toward genuine heroism was one of the story's more moving developmental arcs, represented something that the original had not expected to encounter, the experience of being someone's predecessor, of being the thing that someone else was trying to become. The navigating of this required a kind of grace that was different from the grace required for any other relationship he had managed. Too much presence, and the young man would never find his own version of the role. Too little, and the guidance that experience made available would be withheld from someone who genuinely needed it. He tried to find the middle. He did not always find it. He kept trying. The specific geography of his days, the routes through the city he took as Clark Kent, the aerial paths he followed as Superman, the particular buildings and parks and intersections that had accumulated associations through years of presence, constituted a kind of spatial autobiography that he could read in the city's body the way a traveller reads a landscape they have moved through often enough to know. Metropolis held his history in its streets. The corner where he had caught a falling scaffold and the two workers on it had stood in the aftermath looking at each other with the expression of people who had just been shown something about the nature of the world. The intersection where a conversation with Lois had moved something important in the direction of honesty. The park where he had sat one morning early, when the city was still quiet, and had understood something about the relationship between love and choice that he had not had words for before. If you found something worth keeping in this telling, leave a comment. What stayed with you? What surprised you? Where in the world you're watching from? What time it is where you are? And if there is a story you want told slowly, in the dark, at the pace of breath, leave it below. Sleep well. The morning is already on its way.